Hello, you're with Echelon's Reboot Everything Festival. Now, Sri Lanka's state-owned ventures dominate the market landscape in several important areas of the economy. Now that the country's economy is in a crisis, the spotlight is being cast on these government ventures, their effectiveness, and potentially the need to reform them. Our guests in the studio today both have experience in the state and private sector. Let me introduce to you first Thilan Wijesinghe. Thilan has worked in investment banking, real estate, and has been an entrepreneur. He has had two illustrious stints in government, first as the chairman of the Board of Investment and then as chairman of the National Agency for Public-Private Partnership. Together with Thilan is Daniel Alphonsus. Daniel is an economist, and in his last role in government, he was an advisor to the Ministry of Finance. Daniel, welcome to Echelon.
Daniel, I'll start with you. One of the big obvious problems we see with SOEs is the fact that they are not market pricing the services or products that they are offering. This is an obvious one, but if we step back and look at the whole plethora of challenges that confront SOEs, how would you outline them? What are they?
So I think the challenge Sri Lanka faces is figuring out what the role of the government is vis-a-vis SOEs. And I think there are two big principles that need to be come to some conclusion. The first is, when exactly does the state intervene in the market? Currently, there seems to be no clear principle. The state is involved in areas where there are natural monopolies. So, for example, railways, where it often doesn't make sense to have two train tracks. But then the state is also involved in many highly competitive areas. So, for example, hotels or retail distribution, and so on and so forth. It can be involved in very large enterprises that require a huge amount of capital, for example, oil refining, but also in very small enterprises like BCC, which produces coir products and chemicals. So there seems to be no clear rationale behind why the state is engaging in private enterprise. So I think that's something that first needs to be established. And in my view, considering the consistent lack of capacity of the Sri Lankan state in general, and in particular in commercial areas where we see consistent losses, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second, the state should withdraw from any areas where the private sector can deliver those services at a cheaper price, more efficiently, and at higher quality, and an improved productivity. So in other words, the government should withdraw from any area where there is competition. In the case of natural monopolies, it's a little bit more complex, and that can be a second phase of the discussion. But I think the very first step is for a complete withdrawal of the state from any competitive market. Now, the second principle, I think, is insofar as the state is engaged in private enterprise, in other words, where there are SOEs, that there are no subsidies. In other words, there is full cost recovery, which is what you alluded to. And the reason for this is it creates huge conflicts of interest when you start packaging subsidies with commercial operations. There is often a very good case for providing targeted subsidies of various sorts, but those should be done through specialized agencies that provide that type of service and allow businesses to be run on commercial lines and as competitive, lean, mean operations.
Thilan, I'll bring the same question to you. The state, it appears like, and Daniel suggests, is in a fairly confused state about what its role is vis-a-vis the enterprises it owns.
Actually, the role was quite clear in the late 1990s when I was chairman of the Board of Investment and on the board of the Public Enterprise Reform Commission. We adhered to the same principles that Daniel just outlined, and the government continued to get out of businesses like gas, steel, Sri Lankan Airlines, etc. But there was a complete reversal of that policy commencing from around 2005. And you had situations where privatized companies were taken back, such as Sri Lanka Insurance. And looking at the statistics today, losses by state enterprises are at such vast proportions. Case in point would be Sri Lankan Airlines, which was barely just about breaking even under private ownership. And it was taken back the same year or just a few months before peace came to this country. But despite the growth of tourism, despite the various other favorable factors such as at that time low fuel prices, Sri Lanka continued to rack up losses. So it's very, very clear there's sufficient information, track record that the state cannot run any businesses. And I completely endorse what Daniel just mentioned.
So how do we start unpacking this? Like we've ended up in a situation where the government runs commodity, it sells electricity, fuel. It also runs the BCC, which is a tiny little venture somewhere. How do we sort of approach unpacking this? Is unpacking the priority right now, or is an overarching vision for state enterprises the priority right now?
I think an overarching policy framework and a legal framework is required back again. The PERC law was annulled probably more than 10 years ago. So we need to go back and legislate to ensure that we have a broad policy framework that would enable, whether it's divestiture, PPPs, etc., to take place. And once that happens, I think we can look at state enterprises through different buckets. There would be the easy ones, such as the Building Material Corporation, even Satosa, even BMC, which manufactures soap, as Daniel mentioned. Those could be divested, and the hotels. They could be divested. Yes, maybe some balance sheet restructuring might be necessary. Just to give you the case and point of Building Materials Corporation. When I looked at it about 4 years back, when I was chairman of the PPP agency in the finance ministry, they had 700 million rupees of liabilities, which they couldn't meet for some of the state banks, but they had 12 billion rupees of assets, mostly land. They had land in all of the key commercial locations in Sri Lanka, in the major towns and in Colombo. Now, it would have been a fairly simple exercise. Now, for whatever reason, if the government wanted to remain in the building materials business, it could have done for in a narrow sense to meet the needs of society in a targeted manner, as Daniel mentioned. Again, I'm not saying that's the right approach, but it could have been structured in a manner where the government or BMC could have paid off its debt. Government would have got a huge dividend from the disposal of the land when there was significant demand for the land. So, as I was saying, you need an overarching policy framework and a piece of legislation, or it could be multiple pieces of legislation. For example, the CEB, the Petroleum Corporation, I believe, are governed under separate acts. So these acts might have to be looked at. And then each individual enterprise should be put into separate buckets of short-term, medium, and long-term. And each transaction anyway will be unique. So each enterprise would have to be looked at in isolation or once we have that overarching policy framework.
Okay, clarify this for me, and as we get into this conversation, I think the equity in all these enterprises is owned at the finance ministry level, right? How are they managed? Should not the shareholder have a say? Does the shareholder enforce governance and set expectations for these institutions? Does that offer some solution or some structure in which we can work with?
So I think one of the challenges is the heterogeneity of governance. So you have state-owned enterprises that are government departments, like the Ceylon Government Railway, that is administered under the administrative and financial regulations. Then you have SOEs that are set up under specific acts, as Thilan mentioned, like the Ceylon Petroleum Corporation, that has its own set of governance standards, or the Bank of Ceylon, or People's Bank. Then you have SOEs that come under, I think, a general government-owned business undertakings law or something.
And under the Companies Act, in the case of Sri Lankan Airlines.
That's right. And then you have private limited companies as well. So you have all these different companies, and they all have different reporting requirements. In my view, all state-owned enterprises should be subject to the disclosure requirements of a company listed on the Colombo Stock Exchange. And in order to make that practically enforceable, I would argue, and an idea proposed by Murtaza, is to list debt, which will force them to comply with that regulation.
Thilan, you've had two stints in government, once as chairman of BOI and then later as the chairman of an initiative within the finance ministry looking at public-private partnerships. So you may have had a view about how decisions are made, how things are run. What can we harness from what we have in terms of structures, or do we have enough to harness, or should we like wipe the slate clean and start over?
I believe that the finance ministry needs to play the role of a shareholder activist, so to speak. Currently, the public enterprise department within the finance ministry does not have the required teeth. They are merely a post box. They approve cadres, they approve vehicle purchases and things of that sort. Representation on boards is extremely weak. For example, in many organizations, it's relatively junior level officers of the public enterprise department that sit on boards, who usually are overruled by chairmen of boards of some of these state-owned enterprises. So effectively, the balance of power has shifted significantly in the direction of ministers in charge and the ministries as opposed to the owners. So therefore, I certainly advocate that certain administrative reforms are required. I personally believe that any loss-making state enterprise, a senior level treasury official, either at the secretary treasury level or DST level or a directional level, should sit on the board. Such boards should be given directions as to what they should be spending on capital expenditure. They should be required to stick to KPIs, breaking even, profitability, etc. So until such time the finance ministry exerts authority over these assets or shares that they own, I'm afraid that the line ministries will continue to mismanage these enterprises.
You've seen how government works from the inside. I think the both of you have seen how government works on the inside. Do you feel it has the capacity, the vision currently as it is structured, both with the political leadership and the bureaucracy, to deliver, to create this big vision and to deliver? If not so, if it has gaps, then how do we start addressing that?
Well, now is the better time than any when Sri Lanka, we are facing issues connected to overexposure by the banking system to state-owned enterprises. We had a similar situation in late '95 when we joined government. We had a war situation. We had not at that time started to tap international capital markets, so there was a capital shortage, and decisions were made that the CEB would encourage the private sector to build power plants, and that's how we started our first ever mini hydro and thermal plants, moving on to different kinds of power plants. A decision was made that the port should not remain a monopoly, and we proceeded to do SAGT. I certainly believe that now is the time to develop a strategy and a communication strategy. I cannot emphasize enough the necessity to generate stakeholder support, and this must be done at the level of the finance ministry, to proceed to implement much needed state enterprise reform. And this was a case in the late 1990s. In the case of the port, we developed a very simple message. A port cannot afford to go on strike, and therefore, by definition, port terminal should not be a monopoly of the state. Similarly with telecom, the then Minister Mangala Samaravira said, look here, why should anyone wait 2.5 years to get a fixed telephone line? So there were certain issues that we put before the trade unions, the consumers. We all appeared on television, justified why profit-making enterprises should be privatized. And that was all in order to benefit the consumer. So I believe consumers, the average man on the street, should be educated that by doing what we are doing, we're actually helping him improve his life, as opposed to some other nationalistic interest, which I believe is misplaced.
Daniel, let me come with the same question to you. You've seen the inner workings of government because you've been a consultant to a finance minister and a foreign minister. Do you feel from what you've seen that we have the capability within the bureaucracy and the political leadership to do this? And having seen the insides, what do you suggest our approach be?
So I think ideally we would have done many of these reforms, as was the case in the 95 to 2004 period roughly, where there was effort put to improve governance and reduce politicization, improve the quality of management, and essentially what can broadly be described as governance reform: reduced politicization, improved meritocracy, improved competence, better management. However, in the current situation, I think it's going to be simply necessity that drives these reforms. And there's going to be two types of necessity. First is, in order for the government to hit its fiscal targets, because of the dire situation it's in, it's going to de facto, I imagine, impose hard budget constraints. And that will force the quality of management to improve. So instead of having better boards, better governance, and so on and so forth, rather what was impossible before has become possible now. The second area is that, again, necessity is going to drive privatizations. So already there is a debate on whether domestic debt needs to be restructured. I personally cannot see how we will achieve debt sustainability without some level of restructuring of domestic debt. That will naturally affect the banking sector and may result in the necessity for recapitalization. How the government of Sri Lanka is going to recapitalize the banking sector, I can't see that happening without a significant divestiture of assets. And so that will automatically result in a process of privatization and improved governance and competence in that sector.
Thilan, we weren't always like this. You worked in government in the 1990s when you started at the BOI, but we can go back several more decades. And we had a completely different structure of government where more policy power was with politicians, but it's the bureaucrats who ran things. They were not subject to being shifted around. Perhaps there are lessons in that for Sri Lanka.
No, absolutely. During that time, National Planning Department of the Finance Ministry had a very, very significant role, and today NPD has become impotent, and the foundation for this was again started in the early 2000s, or well, really mid to late 2000s, and we had a finance minister at that time who happened to be the president, who articulated a very, very clear policy. I still remember, I go back to specific instances where there was a decision to be made when it came to Queen Elizabeth Key, which eventually became SAGT. Do we go with a JICA loan, a Japanese government soft loan, or do we go with the PPP? And this debate went on for 8 months. And then finally the finance minister, the president, called for a meeting and told the minister and the ministry and the chairman and management team of SLPA, now you present your case as to why we should go with the JICA loan. And then said, Thilan, your team, you present the case why we should go with the PPP. And in one very simple slide, we had outlined the benefits of a PPP structure, including attracting FDI, greater revenue to the port, the impact of a yen loan on the government's fiscal situation and balance sheet. And the analysis was so succinct and easy to understand. I still recall the statement made by the president to the then minister, this is an open shut case, we must go with the PPP. So that level of analysis can be done by a centralized unit such as a national planning, such as a specialized PPP unit, such as a specialized privatization unit. And as I was mentioning earlier, the communication to the political authority and educating the political authorities also starts from the power of analysis. And that when that analysis is replaced by political ideology, that is when these sense of false senses of nationalism creep in and say, this is a Wikinima, this is an outright sale, this is selling out to the foreigners, they will take their money out. And there's unfortunately no national planning department or debate that is taking place in order to counter such sentiment.
This notion that we are selling the family silver, I mean, is this actually silver in the first place that we have? Are these actually assets?
So in many cases, they're actually a bunch of liabilities. So they're more like shit, really, than family silver. So, and then of course in other cases, the question is, what is the return you get? I suspect in the vast majority of cases, the taxpayer will actually get a greater return from the tax proceeds that arise as a continuous flow from the privatization, more so than even the value of the assets. So in either case, that the taxpayer is benefiting. Lower expenditure, higher tax revenue, and a windfall in the form of the actual divestiture of the assets as well. And then finally, higher productivity and growth in the long term. So for all these reasons, it's super important to privatize the SOEs. And can I just add one more point, which is if we look at our fundamental problem at the moment, it is debt sustainability. How do we make debt sustainable? It's by increasing revenue, reducing expenditure, and by increasing growth. Because if you look at that equation, it's basically revenue minus expenditure over growth. And that's what drives the three factors that drive debt sustainability. Privatization targets every one of these. It increases revenue, both directly and through taxation. It reduces expenditure by reducing losses, and it helps drive growth a lot faster through productivity improvements, and also often brings in FDI. So it's really as close as you get. There's obviously no silver bullets, but it's as close as you get to a silver bullet.
If we get into privatization, I mean, we are looking at a fire sale sort of situation. Is that something that we cannot avoid at this stage? Are there better solutions? If you, as you suggested, Thilan, put assets into several buckets, is that the contours of a solution that we can have to this problem?
One point to make is that we've delayed restructuring some of these enterprises that valuations will become an issue. For example, when I last looked at Sri Lankan Airlines restructuring and privatization, the debt levels owed to state banks and other state enterprises, such as petroleum, was in the region of about $475 million. Today, it's close to $900 million. And therefore, the restructuring process was, that much more easier. Now, how do we create value within Sri Lankan Airlines? One would be to remove the state debt owed to the state and refinance it so that you take it off the balance sheet. And immediately when you look at some of its assets, such as Sri Lankan catering and some of the routes it has, it becomes profitable. I'll just give one more example. Take the CEB. I mean, yes, you're not going to get any price for the CEB because its revenue is far lower than its expenditure. But if you look at CEB's renewable assets, you might be able to package them and market this to a renewable energy fund, for example. And immediately you might get a couple of $100 million into CEB's balance sheet. Then you use that to... So it may not necessarily be that you're privatizing CEB. You're looking at certain assets that are within some of these state-owned enterprises, looking at its commercial value. So yes, the more you delay, obviously the lower prices will be for such assets. But you can actually dress up the balance sheets in a manner that the state would receive optimum pricing. But there's another point. If the state still continues to own, say, 30%, 40%, a minority stake, by virtue of attracting the new management, you would see greater value enhancement in that minority stake as opposed to the state owning 100%. So there can be compensatory factors over time where the state could catch up on some of the value that it gives up at this stage.
On valuations, Daniel, we are going into a fire sale. If we go to market right now, how do we mitigate that?
So I think Thilan has discussed some of the potential ways of mitigation. I just want to make one very quick point, which is without stabilizing the situation, things are going to get worse. And the costs of that are far, far greater than the opportunity cost of higher valuations. So the immediate priority should be macroeconomic stabilization. And as discussed earlier, privatization hits revenue, hits expenditure, hits growth. And therefore, even at fire sale prices, I think we should go ahead.
What is a fire sale price? I'm just asking you, I'm just throwing it out there. Is a 50% discount on net assets a fire sale price? Are we looking at numbers below that?
It's a willing buyer, willing seller issue. I think every state enterprise, if we take, for example, Sri Lanka Telecom, I was chairman of a committee that went out and hired a transaction advisor. So it was Deutsche Morgan Grenfell and DFCC and NDB were the transaction advisors. And then we went through a transparent process, issued RFPs. So you had the highest bid coming from NTT, the Japanese telco, France Telecom and Korea Telecom. So you can achieve price optimization by following due process on the one hand and bringing in specialized transaction advisors who potentially understand where the buyers are, where should we be targeting FDI to come into this in order to attract the widest possible interest. Because if there's competition to bid for these assets, then the government would optimize its value.
Daniel, on valuations, is this the best time to go out there? How do we mitigate that?
So I think Thilan's absolutely right. The challenge for Sri Lanka is less in terms of timing. That we have much less control over. What we do have control over is the process. So ensuring a transparent, apolitical, clean process of privatization is critical. I think Thilan has alluded to exactly how that can be done. I just add one more thought there, which is start with companies where there's already a market price established. If we look at SLT, if we look at some of the hotels and some of the other state-owned enterprises like SLIC, there is already a price established because they are listed on the stock exchange. Therefore, the scope for any irregularities is limited, and that can ensure that the highest value is captured for the taxpayer.
Let me get to you, Thilan. One thing we can potentially, one challenge we will potentially confront here is that these SOEs aren't reporting on IFRS. Very few of them are private limited companies. So you are confronted with understanding their net assets in the first place, right? So this potentially, before privatization, this requires some analysis, some valuation expertise to be brought to bear before you can find out where you stand in the first.
No, absolutely. I mean, the Sri Lanka Ports Authority's latest audited accounts, I believe, are 2 or 3 years old. So there should be specific penalties associated. As Daniel was mentioning, we must follow stock exchange disclosure rules when it comes to financial reporting. At a minimum, they must adhere to standards under the Companies Act, even though it may operate as a separate authority. And that is where committees of parliament, oversight by the finance ministry has to come into play. I think, to answer your question, significant analysis would have to be done, particularly amongst the big fish. Let's look at the highest loss-making 4 or 5 enterprises. I think account for its 80-20 rule, maybe 80% of the state enterprise losses. Sri Lankan Airlines, Petroleum, CEB, Water Board. Did I miss out on any? Those 4 are the biggest. Now each one, the legal structure is different, right? Now in the case of petroleum, what do? Should we be doing a PPP on Sapugaskanda refinery and inject a huge load of capital? The exposure to the state banks is over $2 billion is owed to the state banks. Then you add what Sri Lankan Airlines owes petroleum and the state banks. That's another $700 million US. The numbers are staggering. So therefore, it has to be looked at as, we got to look at it in the context of the overall debt restructuring program to see whether some of these liabilities can be refinanced with 17, 18, 20-year money. Now, in the case of Sri Lankan Airlines, we started speaking to AIIB to see whether we can refinance some of the exposure to the state banks via a separate loan taken under the treasury. And immediately, once you take that loan, as I was mentioning earlier, you create value within the state assets. So there may be other solutions. Who knows? But the fact of the matter is, in order to attract capital, whether it's private local capital or international capital, there has to be a confidence building exercise. At the moment, Sri Lanka suffers from a massive deficit in confidence. So over time, whoever the finance minister is going forward has a crucial role to play in having a credible government that can win the confidence of the international community, which we were able to do at a time of war in the late 1990s and 2000s. If you look at the blue chip companies that invested in this country at that time, I can't remember the last time a non-state-owned blue chip foreign company that invested in this country.
Absolutely. Daniel, we are potentially about to embark on an exercise to recast the Constitution. Now, you don't always associate the Constitution with state-owned enterprise reform. Should we be looking at it like that? Should we look at the potential of SOE reform when we recast the Constitution?
So I think the 2 ways in which SOE reform is linked to constitutional reform. The first is on the funding of SOEs. So, and the second is with respect to their governance. Let's start with the funding. If strong fiscal rules are established for the government of Sri Lanka, that will mean that the blank check that SOEs have had, or quasi-blank check that they've had, will no longer exist. Therefore, again, as discussed earlier, hard budget constraints will start coming into place, and that will automatically improve SOE governance and performance. So that's one. The second is on the governance side of things. And here I see two ways in which the Constitution could improve SOE governance. The first is with respect to the appointment of boards of directors. So currently, the process, as we all know, is highly politicized. In general, it's at ministerial discretion. Instead, through a device like the Constitutional Council or a body that is appointed by it, there could be a nominating board that nominates the directors, or at least ensures that there is some process of veto in place to ensure that high quality directors are put in place, just like the fit and proper test established by the central bank for bank directors. The second way in which governance can improve is through the introduction of competition and the resolution of conflicts of interest. So clear competition and anti-monopoly provisions in the Constitution could prevent state-owned enterprises from exercising their monopolies. And monopolies often tend to lead to inefficiency and rent-seeking and other undesirable management practices. So ensuring that no sector is monopolized by a state-owned enterprise could be one aspect of it. The second is establishing a clear principle that that a given agency cannot perform multiple functions. Let's take the Ports Authority, for example. It is the regulator of the port sector. It is the operator of terminals. It is also the landowner. So it's performing all these different functions, and there is a plethora of conflicts of interest which lead to suboptimal policy making, rent seeking, and even corruption.
This current constitution has been amended 20 times, but we've also seen state enterprises operate under constitutions before the one we have, the 77 constitution. Was it any different for SOEs back then?
So I think the 72 constitution marked a clear break in the structure of the Sri Lankan state. The Public Services Commission, which was responsible for the appointment, promotions and transfers of civil servants, was abolished. And that led to a huge politicization of the civil service, which up to that point had acted relatively independently. Secondly, a section in the Constitution was introduced which removed that the minister not only appointed the secretary, but had general direction and control over the secretary's actions. That was replaced with direction and control. The elimination of the word general transformed the minister from a policymaker into an operational CEO. Instead of setting broad policies, suddenly ministers were responsible for transferring people from A to B and for deciding where specific money was allocated, projects were built, for example, hospitals and roads and so on and so forth, rather than setting the general direction and policy in that specific domain. So this led to a huge politicization and radically changed the incentives that ministers and secretaries had. So to summarize, the minister who was a chairman and the secretary a CEO almost swapped positions. The minister became the person who operationally dealt with transfers, and the secretary became the chairman who dealt with policy issues.
Daniel's talking about Thilan, an era when we had permanent secretaries. How was that different in your view to what we have now?
Well, I was still in school, but my father reported to permanent secretaries, and there was consistency. So despite changes in ministries, the permanent secretary carried through with the policies that were of the then government. But here what happens is, as Daniel was mentioning, a new minister comes, immediately whatever the plans, though I hate the word master plan, these plans are thrown out, and the minister who wants to now learn on the job starts yet another planning process and then decides on what policies to be implemented. So I've seen this time and time again, where as secretaries get shuffled around, particularly in areas such as tourism. I mean, I've lost count of the number of tourism master plans we've had in this country. When I was in government, I used to say that any document, any strategy document should fit into one page and should be easily understood by everyone concerned. And I again go back to the importance of a central unit such as the National Planning Department, an overarching economic council that would advise the head of state, prime minister, finance minister, etc. Now, over time, these have been dismantled by autocratic bureaucrats, to be honest, who themselves started behaving like politicians, possibly hiding behind this particular constitutional provision. So we've got to go back to another important point. We've got to attract talent into the bureaucracy. Now, the last time I was in government, there was at a minimum 1:8 gap between a secretary's salary and an equivalent head of department in a private sector organization. So I would certainly advocate that we should be having provisions to even pay private sector salaries to secretaries of ministries so that we broaden the pool. I mean, subject to, of course, we've got Sri Lanka Administrative Service and things of that sort, but there can be secretaries who can bring international exposure, knowledge, etc. to a particular ministry, let's say transport, for example. Or these ministries should be able to hire these experts on the basis of their qualifications. Now, one of the problems I had was that 4 years ago when I set up the PPP agency, I was told that I cannot pay more than 250,000 rupees per month. It was about 300,000 rupees per month for any private sector professional I bring into government. Now, if I were to inflation adjust that to what I paid private sector professionals who came into government in the late 90s, it was 1/4 of what I paid 20 years ago.
Sure.
Now, what worked, I've seen this actually time and time again. If you looked at the Jayawardena government, Kumaratunga government, etc., any government that implemented some form of reform, you had private sector professionals working hand in glove with state sector officials in order for true reform to happen. I mean, there was in the Economic Council of the CBK government, we had 8-10 individuals, some of them most of them eminent individuals. Dr. Lal Jayawardena, who was the president of the economic think tank in Denmark, for example. So we've got to go back to building capacity within the finance ministry, national planning, and attracting international, local, private sector individuals to work with government. And we really need to restore the dignity of a ministry secretary and heads of department of various government ministries.